closed, even businesses. Anything I'm missing? Noticeably missing? Maybe not. Well, we want to welcome Dr. Erskine Clarke to my left and his wife, Nan. I consider them dear friends. And sometimes when you're in seminary, young at that time, 27-year-old boy, we're intimidated by these seminary students. Actually, I'm never intimidated by anyone. Only one person intimidated me, Rick Llewellyn. You remember Rick Llewellyn, the golfer? I finally beat him and matched it. We always go head-to-head in Myrtle Beach. He's the only person that ever intimidated me, but I deeply respected all the professors at seminary. And during my years there, I can still consider it the heyday of some of the professorship. Jack Keith wrote down some names that meant a lot to me. Tom Long, Charlie Cowles, you've heard me talk about getting caught. My wife played way too much tennis with Dr. Cowles. She was downtown working. Ben Johnson, Bob Ramey, Shirley Guthrie, Catherine Gonzalez, Davison Phillips was the president when I was there. Just a wonderful community. And when Jim and I think back to our calling into seminary, those are, every church I served has been wonderful, but those are some of the happiest days in our life, thinking about walking around seminary campus, trying to figure out what in the world I was doing there. My brother graduated from seminary some years before I did. He was a different personality than I am. He died some years ago. He was president of the senior body, all that kind of junk. President of senior class. I was lucky to go to class. So it was a good experience. And I consider have for years Nan and Erskine a friend. And Jim and I would travel from Leland back through Atlanta, going to South Carolina. And Dr. Clarke's a South Carolinian. Thanks be to God, right? Nan, you're
South Carolina,
that's right. The Low Country, Charleston area. So it's good to have them here with us. But anyway, when we would travel back and forth from Leland to Conway, we would stop by and see Nan and Erskine. And we've kept up via email and colleagues through the years. I consider them a dear friend and trying to get them to come to a church I served. And it's taken 33 years. I read a lot of books, and I guess I have to say that in front of, well, I don't have to say it anymore. I pretended to read a lot of books in seminary. This was one that I guess is required reading in your class because you wanted everyone to buy your book so you can make more money. Wrestling Jacob, A Portrait of Religion in the Old South. I can truly say that this was the most enjoyable book I ever read. These were my notes in the book. That's amazing. I made notes to see if I did there. Yeah, even last chapter. But that is, I guess, your expertise, church history, and especially in the Low Country of the Carolinas. So we're glad to have Erskine and Nan with us tomorrow night and Sunday morning. I said enough. You got 15 minutes.
I know you have a clock back there. It is a great treat to be here. I've told a couple of you, I feel like I have heard about Tupelo and about this congregation for so many years for many reasons. One being that I've known some of your former pastors. Roy Franklin was a good friend, and others who have come through here. Ann Kelly was here for a while, I believe. And Harry Daniel has been here recently. Harry and I were classmates. He was very smart. I was very smart. Harry, wow. So that background, and now that Olin and Jim are here, what a treat for Nan and me to be able to come and be with you and to be with you two especially. It's just really a wonderful gift to us. I must say I'm surprised that there's so many of you here. When I heard there was going to be a movie and popcorn, I expected after a wonderful meal to hear a little bit about history. Might tax your eyes, sleep might come on to you, and a movie might sound really attractive. But thank you for staying. And if If you doze along the way, I'll understand. We used to say that the worst time to try to teach a class was right after lunch. And there's a reason for that. And right after a good meal like we had. And that meal, by the way, was terrific. Can somebody tell me, was it was chicken and grits, or chicken and dressing? It was dressing, okay. I heard that it was chicken and grits, and I thought, well, it's wonderful, but I thought I already knew everything as a South Carolinian about grits. That would have been a new thing for me. Well, what I'm going to do tonight is talk about our Presbyterian family, and I'm going to give a little background to Calvinism generally, and that broad tradition that we call the Reformed tradition, a little historical background to that. And then I want to focus on a very important part of what can be called the culture of Presbyterianism. And that is a quest, generally, among Presbyterians, to find in the midst of controversies or dilemmas of some sort, a middle way. And you can think about your own experience in regard to this, but it's a very broad part of the culture that has marked Presbyterians over the generations. So tonight I'm going to really talk about this background of our Presbyterian family with this focus on middle way. And then tomorrow night I'm going to think with you about white Southern Presbyterians and a middle way slavery and the quest for innocence. The quest that white Presbyterians had in the midst of this deeply oppressive system of slavery, the way in which people of good intent tried to find some middle way and the consequences of that. So that's what we're going to look at tomorrow night. I think it's an area that I've spent a good part of my life as a white Southerner trying to think about and explore, because it has a lot to do with our identity as those of us who are white Southerners, our identity as white Southerners. Then on Sunday morning, I'm going to think with you about Southern Presbyterians and a middle way, science, religion, and a Southern way of life. The way in which this great controversy over evolution that has deep connections to Mississippi Presbyterians and the way in which we really tried to struggle with that, and the link between that and the attempt by white Presbyterians and whites generally in the South to maintain a, quote, Southern way of life. It's a very complex but important story. So tonight, let's think a bit about our Presbyterian family, and I'll go for a little while, and then we'll have some questions and answers. Okay, imagine being at home and sitting around a kitchen table, maybe a round table somewhere in your home with a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle or some person who was knowledgeable about your family, and asking, who are our Presbyterian folk? Tell me about them. Where did they come from? What were they like? What kind of work did they do? What kind of houses did they build and live in? Architecture is really a very interesting subject. It tells a lot about what people value and the way they see the world. Well, what kind of houses did they live in? And where did they go to school? And how important was school for them? And then what did they believe? What did they believe about God? What did they believe about Jesus? What did they believe about human life? And if you are as smart as those of us who are grandparents think our grandchildren are smart, you might ask, did what they believe about God, about Jesus, about human life, about the character of human nature, did that make any difference about the kind of houses they built, about the kind of work that they did, or other aspects of their life, the schools that they went to, and how important, unimportant they thought education was? And you might ask this hard question: did the kind of houses that they lived in, and that we lived in, the kind of houses they built, the kind of work that they did, the kind of music that they sang, the clothes that they wore, did any of that influence what they thought about God, about Jesus, about the character of human life? So I like to think about our home sometime, and how does that shape the way I see the world, the way I live, the arrangement of the rooms and the furniture, and why is it that Presbyterians have historically attracted and nurtured certain kinds of people, and why is it that Presbyterians, in the work that they do, that work often influences the kind of worship that they participate in? Let me give you an example. One of the great experiences for me as a professor has been to be able to go to a variety of denominational settings and in different countries, and to see the richness and diversity of the Christian faith and life. And one of the great experiences for me has been to go to some Pentecostal churches. And in one, I was with a group of students in Jamaica at this marvelous Pentecostal church. Very warm welcome, very serious and exuberant worship service. And there was a lot of waving hands and moving about. And the students later told me that when people around me, and one woman very kindly came over and she could see that I was having a little difficulty with the movement. The students gave me this really hard time afterwards because they said they looked over me while others were leaning back and praising God just with this exuberance, that I got my hands up about this. Why was that? Why is it that that's... Well, I wonder about those questions. And I hope that tonight will help you think about your own background and where you are right now, and how your everyday world has been impacted by your religious faith and life, particularly your Presbyterian participation in the Presbyterian community, and the way your everyday world has impacted that religious side of your life. So that's what I think we need to think about tonight as we think about our family, our Presbyterian family. I like to think of it as a kind of two-way street between a particular social and cultural setting, the world that we live in ordinarily, and the religious beliefs. Marxists will say, that is, people with Karl Marx, Marxists, would say that the world here shapes your religious life. What I want to push is, and I think there's great truth in that, But it is also true, the way in which we respond to that world is shaped by our religious law, by what we think is important, by what we believe about God. And so what I want to emphasize is a kind of two-way dynamic street between who we are as a white South Carolina Presbyterian and the way in which the world that I grew up in has helped to shape, and I'm a part of, has helped to shape my theology, and the way my theology has helped to shape how I'm trying to respond to that world. Okay, so we can tell some stories as we try to think about our family history. Some we know well, others we don't. Let me start with a European background with John Calvin. Calvin emerges as a great theologian and church leader right at the time of the the beginning of the European expansion. He writes his Institutes just a few years after the invasion of Mexico by the Spaniards. He's right in the midst of that period of great turmoil, of European explorations, and of the emergence of the Renaissance in Italy and then in northern Europe. Now, Geneva is transformed by all of this that's going on, and Calvin is in the midst of that and helps with that transformation. And one of the things that begins to happen as Calvin does his work there is that people from all over Europe begin to come to Geneva. You know, Geneva is still a very international city. You think of the Red Cross and other things. It goes back to when Calvin was there, and the city attracted people from all over Europe to study there and to be a part of this new religious movement that was emerging there. And then they go back to their homes. They went back to Hungary, they went back to Germany, they went back to Holland, to the Netherlands, they went back to Scotland, they went back to England and other places. And they carried with them this Calvinism. It's kind of a word that we don't like very much. So we'll say they carried with them this Reformed tradition, this theological and strong ethical and social tradition that they experienced there and learned about there in Geneva. Now, as I said, they were known as Calvinists or the Reformed, and today there is a world alliance of Reformed churches that links us as Presbyterians with other Reformed bodies all over the world. And it's remarkable of what has happened and the character of that Presbyterianism today around the world. You know, there are more Presbyterians in Kenya today than there are in the United States. There's just been this remarkable... The 20th century, by the way, is the century of the greatest growth of the church in the church's history. We think of the church as in conflict and declining. The church has been growing enormously over the last 150 years. In 1910, there were about 9 million Christians below the Sahara in Africa. Today, it is pushing almost 600 million Christians below in that section of Africa, below the Sahara. The country with the largest Christian population of the day is Brazil, and it's estimated that in about 20, 25 years, it's going to be China, because the church is growing so rapidly in China. Now, as a part of this, the country with the largest number of Reformed, of Calvinists, it's amazing. I would have guessed, well, maybe Korea, because we know the Korean Presbyterian Church has really grown. It's one of those very large churches. But it's Indonesia. It's amazing. Indonesia is also the largest population with Islam, but it is of Calvinists. All these Calvinists in Indonesia, it is a part of the dynamic that has taken place. And it's these Presbyterians in Kenya or Indonesia or Korea, and many in China, and also in India. It's growing very rapidly in parts of India, northern tribal areas of Kenya. Well, what about, as we think about that big picture, narrow down closer. So let's try to do this come closer and closer. One of the persons who left Geneva and went back home was John Knox, who went back to Scotland. And you know something of the story. There's a movie out now about Mary, Queen of Scots. I haven't seen it, but I am sure that John Knox gets a very bad press in there because he and, excuse me, Mary, Queen of Scots knocked heads, and among other things, Knox didn't think women should be in charge, and so he's gotten a lot of grief about that recently, as he should. But Scotland is transformed by the return of Knox to his home country. And for our purposes tonight, I want simply to mention that a Presbyterian system, a genuinely Presbyterian system, is developed in Scotland. And that means that Presbyterianism means that the church is governed by elders. It comes from a Greek word meaning elderly, old. And there are the ministry is the ministry of all the people of God, and elders. This is really distinct for Presbyterians. Elders are set aside for certain functions. It's not a sacramental occasion. It's the laying on of hands to set aside elders, both lay elders and ministers of the word and sacrament. They are set aside for a particular function within the larger ministry of the people of God. So you have ruling elders, and you have teaching elders. Teaching elders being the pastors, and the ruling elders being the ones that we ordinarily think of. But both are presbyters, and they have different functions, and both are ordained. Nan and I actually had a very interesting experience 2 years ago. We were in Scotland, and we were visiting a Scottish couple that we know well, and they had this marvelous dinner party for us and invited the most interesting group of people. There was a prominent politician, there was an economist from the university, there was a school teacher, and a minister, and some other people. So there was this, and they were getting ready to vote on whether Scotland would separate from the UK. Okay, so you can imagine the conversation going. And they differed on that. It was a very simple conversation, but they differed strongly. So at one point, Nan and I had spent time in England. I'd been at Cambridge as a visiting fellow there, and we had known that there was this very strong hierarchical social arrangement in England. And in Scotland, it's different. There's an egalitarianism in Scotland. They're huge landowners, but the culture itself has this strong egalitarian character to it. So I asked him, I said, how do you account for that? How is it that Scots have somewhere down deep in their DNA this sense that we all need to be, in some ways, equal? He said a very interesting thing. He said, all of them, even the economists said, the sessions of the Presbyterian churches. Because over the years, the sessions, Presbyterians used to believe in what was called discipline. So if you started messing around somewhere, you'd get called before the session. Or if you had an argument with a neighbor, and it was a scandal to the church that y'all weren't getting along and it was public, you'd get called before the session.
We still do that.
Oh, I knew there was something peculiar about Mississippi Presbyterians. Yeah, that's well, I think we're all glad that that doesn't happen now. But they said was, it didn't matter about the social status of the person. It could be the local laird, the local lord, who's doing something he shouldn't have been doing, and you get called before the session. So it's an interesting part of Presbyterian history, this polity. Well, you've got the Scots. Then in England, you have a group that came to be called, these Calvinists, that came to be called Puritans, English Protestants, who were deeply influenced by Calvin and Calvinism. And the Anglican Church, what in this country is the Episcopal Church, their prayer book and their basic confessional statement, 39 articles, were deeply influenced by Calvinism. But some wanted, as you know from your own study of history, some wanted more radical reforms than had taken place within the Anglican Church, and they came to be called Puritans. And when they came to this country, except in New England, they were generally called dissenters. So they are part of our Presbyterian family. Well, speaking of coming to this country, what about the settlements? Where did people settle? When they came in with this background, this Reformed Calvinist background? Well, you know the Puritans went to New England. You know that story. But there was also strong Puritan settlements in Virginia and Maryland, and also, believe it or not, in South Carolina and in Georgia. Nan grew up in a little church on the coast of South Carolina, right north of Charleston. And in 1690, it's hard to believe that South Carolinians would ask New Englanders to come down until Hilton Head was... A group of Puritans came down. The reason South Carolinians asked them to come was because the South Carolinians were so wild and disorderly. They wanted some godly Puritans to come down and help them bring some stability. So they came down. They went, if you know Charleston, they came in on the Cooper River. They went up the Cooper River and they settled and they established the Wapata Independent Presbyterian Church. And Nan grew up in the new Wapata Presbyterian Church. Anyway, I won't get into all of that. In South Carolina in 1750, and then they moved to Georgia, into Liberty County, Georgia, and Midway Congregational Church, which was basically a Presbyterian church, and it was extremely influential. If you know Atlanta, the name Roswell, Dunwoody, and Gwinnett all came out of that one church. So Puritans coming in, Puritans in New England, Puritans in the South as well. The Scots came in, they came into New York, strong Scottish settlements in New York and Pennsylvania. The Scots came into South Carolina. There is in Charleston, if those of you who've been in Charleston know, there's a First Scots Presbyterian Church right downtown, right below, what we say, below Broad, in the oldest section of the city. A group of Highland Scots came in and settled in Georgia, down at Darien, and were very influential in Georgia history. Now, the ones most closely associated with Presbyterianism, especially in the South, were the Scotch-Irish. And probably there's some of you who think of your ancestors as being in that Scotch-Irish tradition. The Scotch-Irish came in, the great port of entry in the 18th century to the U.S. for immigrants was not New York, like in the 19th century, but it was Philadelphia. And so the Scotch-Irish, who had been lowland Scots, who had come into Northern Ireland after Cromwell had been there and had devastated the area. They were very, very Presbyterian, but anyway, there's a long story about why they needed to eventually start moving. It had to do with English textile laws. But they started coming into Philadelphia. And that's where that's where many people who came into this area, that's where their ancestors came in. They would come into Philadelphia. The land immediately around Philadelphia, by the time the Scotch-Irish was coming in, was already taken up by Germans and some English settlers, and also they began to move west. Some moved across the mountains to what became Fort Pitt, which became Pittsburgh. So Pittsburgh and Philadelphia are great centers of Presbyterianism even today. Very strong. You find very strong country churches out from Pittsburgh, for example. It's surprising, but that's a very strong area. But others turned south and began coming down what was called the Great Philadelphia Wagon Road. It ran out of Pennsylvania, down through the Valley of Virginia, down into North Carolina, down into the Catawba River Valley, right to Charlotte, and then down into South Carolina to a little place called Pine Tree. It's now Camden, South Carolina. And then it divided, and one road went to Charleston, one road went to Augusta, Georgia, and one road went to a little community in the upstate of South Carolina. Now, those Scotch-Irish coming in would, in the next generation, begin to move west. And I'm sure there's some local historians here, they're probably right here in this room, but many of the people coming into this area would be a part of a movement out of the upstate of South Carolina and parts of North Carolina, and some would go over to Tennessee following the rivers, but would be coming into this area. And the Scotch-Irish would have a huge influence on Presbyterianism in the north and in the south. Finally, two other groups just to mention quickly. One of the Dutch. The Dutch were these very strong Calvinists, still are, especially parts of Michigan and today around, let's see, what is the name of that? Let's see, where Hope College is, Calvin College. I'm drawing a blank right now on the name of the cities in Michigan. But anyway, very strong Dutch communities there. And then in New York, of course, and Long Island, Rhode Island, that area. But there was another group that would, in the South, would have an important impact through the families, and those were the French Huguenots, the French Protestants. And there had been wars of religion early on. They had been able to win some freedom in France, freedom of religion, and they flourished in the south of France. But then Louis XIII revoked the Edict of Nantes that had allowed that freedom, and it set in motion the first great wave of European immigrants and refugees fleeing the terrible violence in France against Protestants. And so there were Huguenots that came into New York and came into Virginia and into South Carolina. If you go to Charleston, there's a Huguenot church in Charleston, beautiful little church in Charleston. All right, so these are different groups that came in, and you may want to ask some questions about some of that in a moment. I want to really end with thinking about some competing impulses that are within these different communities that call themselves Reformed. And you can really look back at Calvin himself and see the tension that was there with Calvin. Calvin was right at this big moment of shifting in European history between the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance and the rise of the modern world. And part of Calvin was very scholastic, that is, with its roots in the Middle Ages. And that is a part that feared disorder. You could look around and you could see the shifting of the social world. Think of the expansion that was going on and all this gold flowing in from Mexico and other places in strange new ways, and immigration and change going on. And so there is this fear of disorder and a desire to order everything. So, as you know, Presbyterians believe in doing things decently and in order. And this is one side of our tradition, is to seek order. And it's believed, you look at the universe, you look at the heavens are orderly. And so there's a theological base that God, the way God created the world, there's an order to the world, and we are to try to order life and keep at bay chaos. We do not like chaos and disorder. It's one of the things that's shaking us culturally and socially today, is what seems to be a shaking of the world, and we're struggling in different ways to try to have some order in the midst of that. Well, this is very much a part of being Presbyterian, is to have this concern for order. Presbyterians are really good at order. Committees. So that's that. But there's another side, and that was very much a part of Calvin too, and that was the humanist side. And this side of our tradition doesn't fear disorder. Rather, it fears being boxed in, being caught, being restricted. And there is within this part of our tradition a quest for freedom. And Presbyterians have been very much involved in this quest for freedom. That's a part of who we are. 2 years ago, Nan and I served a little country church. It was a wonderful experience for us in South Carolina, called the Indian Town Presbyterian Church. By the way, there was a Chickasaw Indian group there.
What?
And I feel some connection, and I'll just brag a minute. There was a group of Chickasaw, people of Chickasaw descent in the congregation, and when I left, they made me an honorary member. They gave me the name of Gentle Bear of the Mountains. French over there had never been in a faculty meeting with me. But anyway,
Not far from Conway.
yeah, that's right. It's not. It's great. Well, they are very proud of this congregation because the British burned the church as a sedition shop. That is, it was a part of this revolutionary permit. And you may have heard of the Swamp Fox, this guerrilla fighter in the Revolution, and the elders were his officers. So they were very proud of this side of this quest for freedom. So you have this tension. We want to do things decently and in order. And one of the reasons I can't raise my hands any higher than this is when I was growing up, my mother in particular frowned on me doing squirming, even moving my toes hardly, in church. So we liked order. On the other side, there is this deep awareness that life is full of ambiguity, and you can't order everything. There's mystery in life. There's more to life than what we can arrange. And there is a call, the glorious freedom of the children of God. So there's a deep tension there. And Presbyterians have generally tried to negotiate that tension by saying that the middle is the place of wisdom. That if you go too far on this side, if you go too far to the right, you get in trouble. And if you go too far to the left, you get in trouble. And the middle is not simply a pragmatic place to stand. It is a place of wisdom. Great text that Presbyterian parents used to quote to their children. this one. Thy wisdom dwell with prudence. Presbyterians like prudence. We like to be prudent. Now, what we're going to be looking at tomorrow night is the way white Southern Presbyterians, including a very distinguished Mississippian, tried to follow this middle path in regard to what happened when guns were fired on Fort Sumter and the middle way wouldn't hold. And they saw where the middle way had led. So that's what we're going to be doing tomorrow night. Okay, let's see what questions or observations you have. Now, some of you are probably like me. I don't hear very well. And so I'm going to kind of wander around so I can hear you better if you have a question. And let's see if you have a question.
When you talk about the Scotch-Irish, and
Yes.
the Scotch were from Scotland with the Calvinists and Knox, what were the Irish, were they doing? Is that the same background for them?
Well, it's a very complicated story, but that I don't understand very well. Let me start by saying that. But here's the thing. During the English Civil War, I'm going to give you a big picture on this real quickly. During the English Civil War, where Parliament and the King were fighting, the King's forces were the Cavaliers, the Parliament were the Calvinists, the dissenters, the Puritans, primarily. The war was won by Parliament, and the leader of the army was Cromwell, and Oliver Cromwell. And the Irish, and so Cromwell was a very successful military leader. The Irish rose in rebellion against the English. Cromwell, which they did regularly. The English went in, also some with Scottish troops as well, and devastated what we call Ulster, which is Northern Ireland. And so the land was laid waste, and the population scattered, and so they brought in lowland Scots who settled, and who are their descendants are the Protestants in Northern Ireland, who in the 20th century fought so bitterly against the Irish Catholics. And the Scotch-Irish who came here, they generally call themselves just Irish or Scotch, but over time they began to be called Scotch-Irish. Scots-Irish is a more approved name today because they don't want to get confused with a drink. So they're the ones who came into Philadelphia primarily. Yeah. Yes.
Doesn't a culture of order inevitably lead to a certain resistance to change?
Absolutely. Yeah. And so,
We know that.
I mean, there may be some room in that, some room in recognition, but one of the things that the basic fear is the disorder that comes with change, and it is threatening. I mean, change, and this for me, and I think for most people, major changes are threatening. And so, yes, this is the more conservative side of our tradition, that we want to do things as they have been done, because not only because they're familiar, but also because they keep at bay. They build walls I'm really not being political right now, but they build a wall to keep out the disorder. Yeah. I know there's some questions there that you're just burning to ask. Okay.
You were talking about the Calvinists and the Huguenots.
Yes.
And the Huguenots, and this is going back, and I don't remember names, but they studied under Calvinists, the person that started the Huguenots in France.
That's right.
But what is the theological difference between the Calvinists and the Huguenots? Where did they?
The Huguenots are French Calvinists.
All right, but they're still
They're French. They're very much French Calvinists. Nan's name, she's got all these. I usually don't bring this up because they brag about it a lot. They think when you get cut, you bleed blue. But in Charleston, there is a Huguenot church, and I preached there and lectured there over the years, and it's a very interesting thing. And they each Sunday they recite the 10 Commandments. Very Calvinist thing to do. And they sing a hymn in French. All of these folks who've had 2 years of high school French trying to sing. But anyway, here's the way they've had an influence. It's through these families that have been that have joined. They're Presbyterians. They see themselves as Calvinists, as Presbyterian, and so on. So I can give you some names. Like one name is, let's just say, DeBose. DeBoses, there are Presbyterian DeBoses everywhere, and they come out of this Huguenot tradition. You can name other ones as well.
But can you be Calvinistic and Presbyterian?
What is that?
Can you be Calvinistic and Presbyterian at the same time?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Calvinistic.
Yeah.
And that's what we were arguing about in Bible study. Remember?
But
Yeah, I mean, Presbyterians are one branch of the Calvinist tradition. They are one part of the World Alliance of Reformed Churches. So, yeah.
Well, you mentioned singing, and I don't remember if this was, my mind's not quite this sharp, but that Calvin had a problem with the Huguenots because Calvin believed that a happy heart sang to God. But the Huguenots started putting instruments and music and organ with it, and he thought they had gone way too far.
Yeah.
So he had a problem with, adding music.
Y'all may know that there is a group of Presbyterians called Associative Reformed Presbyterians. Their Vatican is in due west South Carolina, this little tiny town where Erskine College is located. They are distinct within the Presbyterian circles today because they do not sing hymns, they sing only psalms. And there was a great debate within Presbyterian. This is a good example, actually, of the tension between order and freedom. There was a great debate whether you could sing hymns or whether you could only use the metrical psalms. So Isaac Watts was regarded, singing some of his great, what we regard as good old-time hymns. There was great resistance to that. The other thing was instrumental music. So churches fought and divided. Can we have instrumental music? Can we have an organ, a piano? Or do we only have someone who stands up and lines out the music? That is, a kind of music director who leads the congregation in singing. And churches divided over that. The Presbyterians have found wonderful things to divide over. You'd be surprised at what... but that fight has gone on. And you can see it in some other denominations that have been influenced by Calvinism, like the Church of God, Church of Christ. Church of Christ, not Church of God, Church of Christ. And their resistance to instrumental music. And for having some questions. And I hope that the popcorn was good downstairs. Children enjoyed that movie. I've certainly enjoyed being with you, and I look forward to being with you tomorrow night. Thank you.